She called him a murderer on the floor of Congress, on live television, with the cameras rolling and an audience stretching far beyond the chamber itself. And in the script's telling, Ilhan Omar did not hedge, soften, or dress the accusation in the usual language of political disagreement, because she stood during the State of the Union, pointed toward President Donald Trump, and shouted, "You are a murderer, you're a liar," before leaving alongside Rashida Tlaib. The moment was designed to land like a political grenade, not an argument, and for 2 weeks it hung over the national conversation as another example of Washington replacing evidence with volume, accusation with theater, and scrutiny with the assumption that whoever screams first somehow owns the moral high ground. Then came the challenge. Say it again, face to face, without the protective distance of the House chamber, without a prepared exit, without staff members feeding lines from the wings, and without the luxury of hurling the charge and disappearing before the response arrived. Omar accepted, apparently convinced she was walking into a confrontation she could dominate through the same aggressive rhythm that had made the original moment so explosive. But according to the script, what she entered instead was a room where every accusation was about to be answered, not with a louder insult, but with a folder. That contrast became the organizing principle of the entire confrontation. She arrived with attacks, Trump arrived with paper, and from the opening seconds, the evening was framed as a contest between political rhetoric and what he presented as documentary receipts. The Fox News town hall in New York placed two podiums roughly 12 feet apart, filled 400 seats, and, in the script's account, drew tens of millions of live viewers who were not watching a polite policy discussion, but waiting to see whether Omar would repeat the language she had used in Congress when Trump was standing close enough to answer every word. Omar arrived first in a dark blazer carrying a leather portfolio, her notes arranged carefully, visibly prepared for the kind of confrontation in which organization itself becomes part of the armor, while Trump entered only minutes before airtime carrying a single manila folder with a black Sharpie clipped to his breast pocket. No giant binder, no stack of briefing books, no towering collection of legal pads, just 30 pages and a marker, a setup so visually simple that it almost looked unserious until Omar finished speaking and the folder became the center of the broadcast. She took the first 11 minutes and unloaded the full list: fascist, convicted felon, 34 counts, January 6th, Muslim ban, kids in cages, every familiar charge lined up one after another before she aimed her final accusation directly across the stage. "You are the most dangerous man in America, and history will remember you as the tyrant who tried to destroy everything this nation stands for," she said, and the upper gallery erupted while Trump remained at his podium, hands still, head tilted, watching rather than interrupting. When the applause finally died, Trump uncapped the Sharpie, wrote something across the folder, briefly lifted it toward the cameras, and then asked the two-word question that instantly changed the direction of the room. "You done?" The script presents the moment as almost brutally economical, because after 11 minutes of accusation, he did not answer with 11 minutes of counter-insults. Instead, he tapped the folder and said he had been waiting to do this since she screamed at him in the Capitol, adding that he did not need a giant binder because, in his words, the truth fits right here. Then came the first number, written large enough to become the visual anchor of the segment. 2.9 million, the amount the script says Omar's campaign paid to E Street Group, a company owned by Tim Minett, whom the script repeatedly identifies through the personal relationship allegations surrounding Omar. Trump held the sheet toward the camera while the ink was still wet and shifted immediately from the size of the payments to the circumstances surrounding Minett's previous marriage, citing a divorce filing in which Minett's then-wife allegedly said that her husband had told her he was in love with Omar. The effect was deliberately cumulative: campaign money, a company, a personal relationship, a divorce filing, and the suggestion that what Omar had presented publicly as ordinary campaign spending deserved much closer examination. Trump then laid the page face up on the podium as if he were putting an exhibit into evidence and walked the audience through the sequence in plain language, arguing that campaign money was moving into the company of a man whose private life had already become entangled with the Congresswoman's public story. Omar pushed back by saying the Federal Election Commission had investigated and dismissed the matter, but Trump immediately challenged that characterization, arguing that an inability to take action because the commission lacked sufficient members was not the same thing as a factual exoneration. That distinction mattered because it stripped away the comfort of the word dismissed, replacing it with a narrower and far less flattering proposition. The institution may not have reached the merits in the way her defense implied. Trump's response was not subtle, and it was not meant to be, because he insisted that couldn't get to it and cleared were not interchangeable phrases, no matter how useful they might look in a press statement. From there, he moved to another figure, July 2020, when the script claims that Omar's campaign spent roughly $66,000 and that 77% of that amount went to E Street Group. He wrote 77% beneath the first number and held the paper up again, turning the percentage into a political weapon because percentages are harder to blur with adjectives than ordinary campaign rhetoric, especially when the audience has already been told exactly where the money was going. Trump translated the figure into donor language, arguing that if an ordinary supporter in Minneapolis sent $20 because he or she believed in the campaign, more than $15 of that contribution would effectively be going toward the company at the center of the dispute. Whether one accepted his framing or not, the structure of the attack was obvious. Take a complicated campaign finance controversy, reduce it to one number, connect that number to an ordinary donor, and force Omar to defend the proportion rather than retreat into general claims about procedure. The script then escalates by having Trump reach deeper into the folder and introduce what he describes as internal billing material supplied to investigators by a former E Street Group employee, claiming that certain consulting invoices corresponded with dates when Omar and Minette were traveling together. Trump's accusation was sharpened into one brutal line. Donors thought they were paying for campaign work, while he alleged the money was connected to personal travel, and he summarized the claim with the phrase, "That's not consulting, that's embezzlement with a better filing system." Omar's hands moved toward the edges of the podium as the segment tightened around financial questions, and the script describes her posture changing before Trump shifted into a lighter, almost amused tone and introduced what he called the magic trick. This time the target was not campaign spending, but the reported value of businesses connected to Omar's husband, including a California winery and Rose Lake Capital, which the script says were valued together at approximately $700 at the end of 2023. Trump wrote 700 on the page, paused long enough for the absurdity of such a tiny valuation to register, and then announced the next figure. According to the congressional financial disclosure described in the script, the same businesses were later reported at a combined value reaching as high as $30 million. He wrote 30,000 next to the first figure, drew attention to the jump, and mocked the idea that $700 could become $30 million in roughly a year, comparing the transformation to a magic act so spectacular that professional illusionists would have trouble competing with it. The sarcasm worked because he did not need to add another accusation at that instant. The visual alone, $700 beside $30 million, was presented as the accusation. Then came the reversal that made the sequence even more damaging within the script's framing. After questions began circulating, Omar filed an amended disclosure, and Trump wrote a third number on the page, E0, turning the sequence into $700, then $30 million, then nothing. He described the shift as the greatest disappearing act in congressional history and connected it to Omar's public statement that she was not a millionaire, arguing that her own filings had created the contradiction now sitting in front of the cameras. Trump looked directly toward the audience and contrasted the allegations against him with the paper trail he was displaying against her, saying she had called him a con man even though, in his formulation, his businesses were physical buildings, while the financial value attached to her husband's businesses appeared to rise and vanish on paper. He then turned back toward Omar and asked the question the entire setup had been building toward. Where did the 30 million come from? Where did it go? And could she account for it the way she expected him to account for every dollar examined in years of investigations? Omar answered that the valuations came from her husband's accountants and that the discrepancy was a filing error corrected voluntarily, but Trump seized on the size of the error itself, arguing that a $30 million mistake left only two possibilities in his framing: incompetence or fraud. Trump did not leave the $30 million discrepancy sitting as an isolated bookkeeping embarrassment, because the script immediately pushes the confrontation into a broader question of credibility, accountability, and the difference between demanding transparency from others while resisting it when the questions turn inward. He slid the financial disclosure page aside, let the three numbers remain visible to the audience, and summarized the sequence with the same contemptuous simplicity that had made the previous section land so hard. Millions connected to the boyfriend's company, millions appearing in a business valuation, then millions disappearing when scrutiny arrived. "And she's the one calling me a criminal," he said, shaking his head as if the contradiction itself were too obvious to require ornament, before adding that she had effectively made up $30 million and then unmade it when the paperwork became inconvenient. The laughter in the room did not erase the seriousness of the accusation, because the humor was functioning as a blade rather than a release, sharpening the suggestion that what looked absurd on paper could still carry legal consequences if the underlying disclosures were inaccurate. Then Trump closed the first section of the manila folder, opened the second, and according to the script, the mood shifted immediately from mocking financial arithmetic to something colder and far more personal. He reminded the audience that he had spent years under investigation, listing Russia, 2 impeachments, the New York criminal case, tax reviews, business examinations, phone records, family business scrutiny, legal files, and what he described as 14 years of tax returns pulled apart by investigators searching for wrongdoing. The argument was not that scrutiny should disappear, but that he had been subjected to an almost industrial level of it and had still been expected to answer every subpoena, deposition, audit, and accusation placed in front of him. Then, with one deliberately provocative sentence, he pivoted toward the most explosive allegation surrounding Omar's personal history. "But I never married my brother." The lower gallery erupted while the upper gallery stiffened, and the script makes clear that Trump understood exactly how incendiary the line was, because he immediately slowed down and stressed that he was not claiming to possess judicial proof of the allegation. Instead, he framed what followed as a timeline of unresolved questions, insisting that the issue was not whether he personally knew the answer, but whether Omar had ever provided the kind of documentary clarity that would finally put the controversy to rest. Trump laid out the sequence beginning in 2002, when the script says Omar entered a religious marriage with Ahmed Hirsi and had 2 children with him, then moved to 2009, when she legally married Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi, a British citizen, while the earlier religious relationship remained part of the background. He continued to 2011, when Omar and Elmi separated, and then to 2012, when she had a 3rd child whose father, according to the script, was Hirsi, rather than the man who was still legally her husband. Trump did not rush the dates because the point was the overlap itself, the confusing intersection of religious marriage, legal marriage, separation, children, tax filings, and later divorce, all of it compressed into a timeline that he presented as far more complicated than an ordinary private life dispute. He then highlighted 2014 and 2015, claiming that Omar filed joint federal tax returns with Hirsi even though Elmi remained her legal husband, and he invoked the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board, fine referenced in the original script, as part of the broader record surrounding those filings. The effect was to turn what Omar's defenders had long described as a smear into, at minimum within the script's framing, a sequence of dates and documents that Trump insisted still demanded a direct answer. From there, he moved to 2017, when the script says Omar finally divorced Elmi, later married Hirsi, later divorced Hirsi, and then married Tim Minot, linking the personal timeline back to the financial controversy that had opened the evening. Trump's presentation was ruthless because he was not treating each issue as separate. He was stacking them, making the campaign payments, marital history, tax filings, and immigration questions appear like different rooms inside the same house of unanswered explanations. Then he asked the question that had hovered around Omar for years: whether Ahmed Elmi was her brother, a claim the script itself presents as an allegation rather than something conclusively established. Trump said plainly that he did not have a birth certificate and had not seen a DNA test, but he claimed to possess university material showing Elmi listing Omar as a sister on an emergency contact form, along with records he said connected Omar, Elmi, and Hirsi to the same address. The script's attack depended on that distinction. Trump did not claim final proof, but he argued that the existence of disputed documentary fragments made Omar's refusal to release more records look less like closure and more like avoidance. He then turned the allegation into a live challenge, offering Omar what he described as the simplest possible path to end the controversy: authorize the release of her immigration records and let the documents speak for themselves. Trump said that if the records showed nothing improper, he would publicly say he had been wrong, not quietly, not through a lawyer, but on the stage, on Fox, on Truth Social, and everywhere else where the accusation had circulated. The challenge was deliberately designed so that refusal itself could be framed as suspicious, because Trump argued that he had answered years of subpoenas and audits, while Omar had spent years calling the underlying question racist rather than producing records that, in his view, could settle it. He then invoked Somali Americans in her district who had immigrated legally and completed every required form, arguing that asking for transparency about her own paperwork was not an attack on ethnicity, but a demand for the same documentary accountability applied to everyone else. Omar answered that the allegation was a racist smear that had been debunked, and Trump immediately seized on the word debunked as the next target. "It hasn't been debunked, it's been denied," he replied, drawing a distinction the script uses repeatedly throughout the town hall between rejecting an allegation rhetorically and disproving it with evidence. He argued that debunking required producing evidence that caused the claim to collapse, while denial required only saying the accusation was false and refusing further disclosure, and he insisted that Omar had done the latter for 8 years. The exchange was not subtle, but subtlety was never the point of the format, because Trump was trying to force every controversy into a binary frame that could be understood by viewers without legal training. Records or no records, numbers or excuses, release or refusal. He closed the second section of the folder without allowing the room to settle, because the script's structure depended on pressure, one controversy arriving before Omar had enough time to regain control from the previous one. Next came a newspaper clipping carrying the name Amy Bach and the massive Feeding Our Future fraud scandal in Minnesota, shifting the confrontation from Omar's personal history to money that had been intended for hungry children. Trump described the scandal as the largest pandemic-related fraud case of its kind and repeatedly emphasized the enormous dollar figure attached to it, presenting the theft not as an abstract accounting loss, but as money designed to put food in front of children during a national emergency. He then produced what the script identifies as a summary from a Minnesota House fraud prevention report and argued that legislation associated with Omar, specifically the Meals Act, helped remove safeguards from federal nutrition programs at the moment when unprecedented amounts of emergency money were flooding into the system. He accused the provision of opening participation to for-profit restaurants and loosening verification through grab-and-go distribution, framing the law as a door that fraudsters later exploited once oversight had been weakened. Trump's central argument was brutally simple. Even if Omar had not personally stolen the money, she had helped create rules that reduced barriers, and when investigators later came asking questions, the script claims she did not provide the level of cooperation they wanted. Omar pushed back immediately, reminding him that the provision had been included in legislation he signed and implemented under his own administration. Trump rejected the attempt to spread responsibility back toward him, arguing that he had signed a massive emergency package containing thousands of pages during the pandemic, while Omar had been directly involved with the specific provision under scrutiny. He insisted that the difference between signing a gigantic crisis bill and writing a particular section mattered, because in his framing authorship brought a deeper obligation to understand the risks built into the language. Then, instead of remaining in the procedural fight over statutes and implementation, he reached into the folder and removed a handwritten letter, changing the tone again by moving from billions of federal dollars to one family. The script identifies the writer as Fatima, a Somali American immigrant living in Omar's district whose children had participated in a legitimate meal program that later lost funding, and Trump held the letter differently from the other documents, with both hands rather than waving it toward the cameras like another exhibit. The message of the transition was obvious. Billions can become abstract. Committee reports can become partisan noise. But one mother saying her children lost meals because money disappeared was meant to make the entire scandal impossible to hide behind Washington language. Trump read the portion of the letter in which Fatima said she had come to America because she believed in the country, followed the rules, filed the forms, and now watched her children suffer because money intended to help families had allegedly been stolen, while political leaders avoided responsibility. He set the letter down and, according to the script, the showman's expression tightened into something harder because this was no longer presented as an argument about political embarrassment, but about children losing food while adults fought over jurisdiction and blame. $9 billion stolen from kids, he said, then attacked Omar for what he characterized as treating investigators and oversight as the source of the problem rather than the fraud itself. Before Omar could redirect the exchange into another procedural defense, Trump changed subjects with almost no transition, preserving the relentless rhythm that defined the confrontation in bringing up her widely criticized 2019 description of September 11th as a moment when some people did something. The next section of the folder was no longer about campaign money, marriages, immigration paperwork, or nutrition fraud. It was about words, memory, national trauma, and the question of how a member of Congress had chosen to describe the deadliest terrorist attack ever carried out on American soil. Trump did not raise his voice when he reached the September 11th section, and according to the script, that restraint made the attack more severe because he was no longer playing with numbers on a page or mocking a disclosure that appeared to rise and vanish. He was forcing the room to confront language Omar herself had used publicly. He repeated the phrase, "Some people did something," then contrasted its casual construction with the scale of September 11th, invoking the thousands killed and the permanent scar left on New York, the country, and families who never stopped carrying the consequences of that morning. Trump reminded the audience that he had been in Manhattan when the towers fell, that he knew people affected by the attacks, and that he viewed Omar's wording not as an innocent verbal shortcut, but as a grotesque reduction of an event that demanded precision, gravity, and respect. He then produced the photograph described in the script of Nicholas Harris Jr., whose mother was killed in the World Trade Center and who later wore Omar's words across a shirt while publicly asking her to apologize, turning her sentence from an old controversy into something attached to an identifiable victim's family. The point was not complicated. Trump wanted viewers to see that political language does not disappear after the microphone turns off, especially when survivors and relatives of the dead are left listening to politicians describe history in ways they consider insulting. From there, he widened the indictment, moving through Omar's past statements involving Israel, Jewish Americans, money, loyalty, and the comparison of the United States and Israel with Hamas and the Taliban, presenting them as a pattern rather than a collection of unrelated controversies. The script has him reference, Israel has hypnotized the world. It's all about the Benjamins, accusations involving dual loyalty, and later remarks about Jewish students, using each episode to argue that Omar had repeatedly crossed lines her defenders later tried to redraw as misunderstandings. He emphasized congressional condemnation because, in his framing, criticism from political opponents could always be dismissed as partisan hostility, while rebukes that drew support from members of Omar's own party were harder to wave away with the same excuse. Trump then compressed the entire sequence into one accusatory inventory. Billions connected to fraud against programs for children, September 11th reduced to an infamous phrase, repeated controversies involving Jewish Americans and Israel, and a congresswoman who still believed she occupied the unquestioned moral high ground when confronting him. He looked directly at Omar and asked, "Who's the dangerous one, Representative? Really, who?" leaving the question hanging not as an invitation for a philosophical debate, but as the culmination of the record he had spent the night assembling. Omar tried to break through by accusing Trump of exploiting tragedy for political purposes, but he immediately rejected the escape route, telling her that he was reading her words, her record, and the committee material described in the script rather than inventing tragedies for rhetorical effect. His response was deliberately unforgiving. If placing her own statements next to their consequences made the record look ugly, then the ugliness belonged to the record and not to the person reading it aloud. The confrontation had by that point abandoned nearly every comfortable refuge available in ordinary cable news argument, because each time Omar attempted to move toward motive, identity, or Trump's character, he dragged the discussion back toward a document, quotation, date, percentage, or report. Her staffer leaned forward, the script says, while Omar's hand remained tight around the podium, and the physical tension became another visual layer in a debate increasingly structured around whether she could directly answer the specific claims instead of attacking the person presenting them. Then the monitor beside her podium came alive, and Trump introduced the section that the script treats as one of the most politically explosive of the entire town hall, Omar's January 2024 remarks to a Somali American audience. The screen showed Omar speaking in Somali before a Minneapolis crowd, with English subtitles representing the controversial translation that had circulated widely online, including language portraying Somali interests as something she would defend from within the American political system. Trump allowed the clip to run rather than talking over it, letting the audience hear the cadence and watch Omar speaking confidently before freezing the image at the moment most useful to the argument he was constructing. He repeated the phrases highlighted in the translation, including, "inside the U.S. system, protect the interests of Somalia," and "Somalians first," and then contrasted them with the oath of allegiance required during naturalization. Pulling out another sheet, he recited the portion of the oath renouncing allegiance and fidelity to foreign states, then argued that any naturalized member of Congress who publicly appeared to prioritize a foreign country's interests deserved far more scrutiny than a routine partisan defense could provide. the attack was intentionally direct because Trump was no longer asking whether Omar's rhetoric was merely careless. He was questioning whether the political loyalty expressed in the speech could be reconciled with the oath attached to American citizenship and congressional service. Omar answered that the translation was inaccurate and had been debunked, a defense that immediately returned the town hall to the same dispute over denial versus documentary proof that had surfaced earlier when Trump challenged her response to the marriage allegations. Trump countered by claiming he had consulted 3 independent Somali-speaking interpreters who, in the Scripps account, agreed with the substance of the controversial translation, and he held up what he described as their report to prevent the argument from collapsing into a simple contest between his English and her Somali. Then he made the more strategically difficult move of accepting Omar's own preferred interpretation for the sake of argument, saying that even her office's version still portrayed her as using her congressional position to influence matters involving Somalia and the Ethiopia-Somaliland dispute. That maneuver narrowed the room available for rebuttal because Trump's argument became that the most inflammatory translation did not need to be perfectly accurate for the underlying political question to remain damaging. In his framing, either version still forced Omar to explain why her language toward a Somali audience sounded so different from the universal language expected from an American legislator representing citizens of many backgrounds. Trump stepped away from the security of his podium and slightly toward the center of the stage, ensuring that the cameras could capture both figures as he returned to the insult that had started the entire encounter. Omar calling him a murderer during the State of the Union. He said that what he believed he had witnessed in the Capitol was not simply moral fury over policy, but a politician reacting defensively because investigations, fraud questions, financial scrutiny, and political pressure were moving closer to issues surrounding her own record. The script has him accuse her of fear rather than outrage, suggesting that the screaming had been a shield, an attempt to overwhelm uncomfortable questions before anyone could insist on answers. "That's what the screaming was about, wasn't it?" he said, pressing the allegation that her anger had less to do with principle than with the possibility of what investigators might eventually discover. It was an accusation aimed at motive rather than a proven fact. But within the script, it functioned as the connective tissue tying together every previous segment. Campaign money, disclosures, marriages, fraud investigations, controversial rhetoric, and the Somalia speech. Omar rose from her chair abruptly, the scrape against the studio floor cutting through the microphones, and declared that she would not remain on stage while being called a traitor by a man she accused of inciting an insurrection. Trump immediately responded, "Sit down, I'm not done," not shouting, but using the same clipped television authority cadence the script repeatedly emphasizes, and he reminded her that she had already taken her turn to scream accusations during the State of the Union and had walked out afterward. His argument now became procedural as much as political. She had demanded the right to speak without interruption when she was attacking him, so she could not demand an immediate exit simply because the response had become uncomfortable. "Now I'm talking, and I have receipts," he said, reducing the entire evening again to the contrast the script had established at the beginning between denunciation and documentation. Omar turned toward the moderator instead, requesting intervention while staff behind the camera line began to move, and her counsel stood, making it increasingly clear that the debate itself was about to become secondary to whether she would remain on the stage. The moderator stated that Trump still had several minutes remaining, and Omar gathered her notes while the tension in the studio shifted from verbal combat toward imminent departure. Trump saw the movement and used it instantly, telling her that walking away was exactly what she had done at the State of the Union, exactly what the script accused her of doing when fraud investigators wanted answers, and exactly what he claimed she did whenever questions reached her marriages, finances, or loyalty. She moved toward the edge of the stage while multiple cameras followed, turning the physical act of leaving into the image Trump wanted viewers to remember more clearly than any sentence spoken during the previous hour. "Walking away is what you do best, Representative," he called after her, before adding that investigations did not disappear merely because the person being investigated had left the room. The stage door opened. Omar passed through it, and the door closed behind her, leaving one occupied podium, one abandoned podium, scattered notes, a leather portfolio, and a television moment the script was already treating as political symbolism. For several seconds, Trump said nothing, and the silence itself became the sharpest punctuation available after a confrontation built almost entirely on relentless speech. He looked across at Omar's empty podium, then toward the camera, and returned to the central accusation of the evening. She had publicly called him a murderer, yet when confronted with questions about money, marriages, loyalty, and the fraud controversy described in the script, she had chosen to leave rather than continue the exchange. Trump picked up the thin manila folder and emphasized its size again, presenting 30 pages as sufficient to survive a confrontation that 11 minutes of opening attacks had failed to control. He contrasted his own history of investigations, audits, depositions, subpoenas, and criminal proceedings with Omar's departure from one televised town hall, framing persistence under scrutiny as evidence of strength and departure as evidence of weakness. "She walked out. The investigation won't," he said, closing the confrontation with a line designed to carry beyond the studio and into the political aftermath that followed. The clip of Omar leaving began spreading across social platforms almost immediately in the script's account, but it was not only the exit itself that circulated, because individual moments from earlier in the debate were cut into separate viral fragments and pushed into entirely different audiences. Her hand tightening against the podium during the disclosure discussion, Trump's provocative "I never married my brother" line, the $700 to $30 million graphic, the Somalia translation dispute, and the abandoned portfolio all became visual shorthand for the confrontation. Omar walks out, Somalia first, and 9 billion were presented as slogans detached from the longer arguments that created them, exactly the way modern political media transforms hour-long events into 10-second identity tests. Trump's "walking away is what you do best" line became meme material, applied far beyond politics, because a phrase built for one confrontation can survive indefinitely once the internet discovers it works as a caption. The town hall itself had ended, but within the architecture of the script, the more dangerous phase was only beginning, because now Omar no longer had to answer one man across a stage. She had to answer the replay, the headlines, the clips, the questions, and the political consequences spreading outside the room. Omar's response arrived 36 hours later in the form of a pre-recorded video lasting 2 minutes and 40 seconds. And according to the script, she framed the entire town hall as a coordinated racist spectacle designed to dehumanize a black Muslim woman rather than as a legitimate demand for answers about the controversies Trump had raised. She spoke about threats, invoked her refugee background, reminded viewers repeatedly that Trump had been convicted on 34 felony counts, and returned to the familiar argument that political attacks against her were inseparable from attacks on her identity. What the script emphasizes, however, is what she did not address. No detailed answer about the E Street Group payments. No explanation of the reported financial disclosure swing from roughly $700 to as much as $30 million and then back to zero. No direct engagement with the feeding our future arguments. No substantial response to the Somalia speech controversy, and no release of the immigration records Trump had challenged her to produce. In the script's framing, 2 minutes of counterattack generated plenty of political language, but almost none of the direct answers demanded on stage. And that gap became more damaging than the insults themselves because the entire confrontation had been constructed around the contrast between accusation and documentation. The pattern that had protected Omar through years of controversy, was now portrayed as malfunctioning under pressure because Trump had deliberately reduced complicated scandals into numbers, dates, filings, and direct questions that were much harder to bury beneath another argument about motive. The political fallout accelerated almost immediately, and the script describes House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries being asked about the town hall only days later, responding with the restrained language that members should remain transparent with the public regarding their financial disclosures. That sentence was hardly a condemnation, but within Washington's carefully coded vocabulary, the script interprets it as something more damaging than silence, because Jeffries defended a principle rather than personally validating Omar's explanations, leaving her to carry the factual burden herself. Squad allies rallied around her, with Rashida Tlaib condemning what she characterized as Islamophobic theater, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez expressing support, and Ayanna Pressley discussing what she described as the systematic targeting of women of color. But the script relentlessly stresses that those statements defended Omar as a person without directly answering the financial questions attached to the town hall. That distinction became the weakness. Solidarity could demonstrate loyalty, but it could not explain a campaign payment, reconcile a disclosure, answer an immigration record challenge, or make the questions surrounding the Minnesota fraud controversy disappear. Even commentators sympathetic to Omar, the script claims, began recognizing that defending identity and defending a factual record were no longer interchangeable tasks, especially once viewers could replay individual segments and compare each question with the answers that had actually been given. From there, the script moves into the institutional consequences, claiming that the House Oversight Committee expanded scrutiny of Omar's financial disclosures and that investigators sought records connected to Tim Minett, Rose Lake Capital, E Street Group, and related business entities. It further describes a preliminary ethics review focusing on the discrepancy involving the business valuations, while portraying an already existing Justice Department inquiry as continuing beneath the noise of the televised confrontation rather than being created by it. The script's central argument is that this mattered because Omar's easiest political defense had always been to characterize every investigation as another partisan assault manufactured by conservatives. Yet, an inquiry that had begun before the town hall complicated that explanation and allowed Trump's supporters to argue that the folder on stage was amplifying questions that were already alive elsewhere. Public attention, in this telling, transformed bureaucratic paperwork into a political emergency because material that would normally disappear inside committee documents and financial forms was now being repeated in viral clips, reaching millions of people who had never opened a congressional disclosure in their lives. Once that happened, the controversy stopped belonging exclusively to lawyers, ethics officers, and campaign operatives and became something voters could reduce to three brutal numbers: 730 million, 0. The script then shifts back to Minnesota, where the damage is portrayed not as temporary outrage among national cable news viewers, but as something cutting directly into Omar's political base. It claims that post-town hall polling showed a sharp decline in her approval, particularly among older voters, while a Somali American businesswoman and CPA named Amina Farah emerged as a primary challenger, able to present herself not as an outsider attacking the community, but as someone from within it demanding stricter financial accountability. Farah's campaign, according to the script, raised millions in small-dollar donations after the broadcast and released a video built almost entirely around the three figures Trump had placed on the page, saying that as an accountant she understood exactly what $700 looked like, what $30 million looked like, and what zero looked like. The brilliance of that political attack was its simplicity, because it did not require voters to accept every allegation made during the town hall. It required only that they believe a member of Congress should be capable of explaining her own signed financial disclosures without producing a valuation sequence that looked impossible to ordinary people. Omar's problem, therefore, was no longer merely Trump, because once a controversy provides language that a primary opponent can use inside the district, national spectacle becomes local ammunition. Progressive media, which the script says had previously responded to Omar controversies with reflexive defensive framing, began what it describes as a slower and more cautious retreat, raising questions about transparency and accountability without necessarily embracing Trump's broader conclusions. A Vox analysis is described as focusing on a transparency problem. A Minneapolis progressive podcast devoted an episode to financial accountability without directly centering Omar's name, and a Somali American academic essay argued that representation without accountability was not representation at all. The script treats those developments as more threatening than another conservative headline, because criticism from ideological opponents is easy to dismiss, while doubt inside one's own coalition can erode the assumption that every accusation will automatically produce a defensive wall. Omar had built political strength partly through the argument that attacks on her were attacks on marginalized representation, but the town hall's aftermath was portrayed as separating those two questions and forcing supporters to confront whether representation itself required stricter answers when money, filings, and public trust were involved. That was the shift Trump's folder had been designed to produce. Not universal agreement with him, but enough doubt among people who normally rejected him that Omar could no longer rely on partisan instinct to close the conversation. The script escalates further by describing Rose Lake Capital coming under additional scrutiny after investigators allegedly flagged international wire transfers, while another business associated with Minette was said to have dissolved, and outside watchdog organizations demanded a more complete examination of Omar's disclosures. It emphasizes that knowingly filing false congressional financial reports could carry serious consequences, but the script does not present a conviction at this stage. Instead, it depicts legal exposure tightening through complaints, records requests, financial examination, and the possibility that earlier discrepancies could become more significant if investigators found evidence behind them. At the same time, Omar's broader political brand was portrayed as shrinking, with speaking opportunities disappearing, university appearances being canceled, and progressive organizations beginning to replace her with other speakers rather than assuming controversy would eventually blow over. The point was not that one television appearance had instantly destroyed a career, but that the broadcast had allegedly changed the cost of association, turning what had previously been manageable controversy into a recurring question that every host, donor, institution, and political ally now had to calculate before putting Omar's name on a stage. In Washington, survival often depends less on being loved than on remaining useful, and the script portrays the town hall as the moment when defending Omar began requiring more political energy than many allies were willing to spend. Then, the narrative returns to Fatima Abdi, the Somali American mother whose letter Trump had read on national television, bringing the argument back down from committees and millions of dollars to the apartment where the consequences were supposedly felt in ordinary life. The script places her only blocks from Omar's district office, sitting on a living room couch while her 9-year-old daughter worked at the kitchen table and her 7-year-old son drew birds on the back of a grocery receipt, a quiet domestic scene contrasted against the enormous political machinery spinning outside. When Omar's response video appeared on Fatima's phone, the script says she listened to the language about racism and dehumanization, but heard nothing answering the questions about the money intended for children, and that absence mattered more to her than another partisan argument about Trump. She closed the video, sat with the sound of her children in the apartment, then searched for Amina Farah's campaign and donated $25, a tiny contribution compared with the millions discussed throughout the town hall, but one the script treats as symbolically more important because it represented a voter changing direction. No speech was necessary because the act itself carried the judgment. Accountability had stopped being an abstract Washington word and had become personal. That is where the script ultimately wants the audience to land, not on the volume of the State of the Union confrontation, but on the difference between screaming an accusation and surviving the questions that follow it. Omar had entered the original confrontation calling Trump a murderer and a liar, confident that the moral force of the accusation would define the story, while Trump's response was constructed around a thin folder, a marker, a series of numbers, and a succession of controversies he believed she had never adequately answered. She brought rage, the script says. He brought receipts. She walked away. He remained. And the investigations described in the narrative continued regardless of whether the television cameras were still running. The closing challenge is therefore deliberately partisan and deliberately unsparing. Judge the confrontation by the answers, not the volume, by the disclosures, not the slogans, by the records, not the identities politicians invoke when scrutiny becomes uncomfortable, and by whether the people demanding accountability from everyone else can survive the same standard when it reaches their own desk. She walked out. The script concludes. But the questions did not walk out with her, because a political performance can end when the stage door closes, while a document, once exposed to public scrutiny, keeps demanding an explanation long after the applause is gone.